have the intention to show how the construction and the implementation of this policy is shaped in France and Quebec through many factors: actor, configuration, sense-making, set of tools, etc. So we provide a multi-level analysis of a policy trajectory, and whose effects are not reduced to the general and diffuse impact of a transnational discourse, such as the neoliberal one. So the theoretical perspective that we have used is a hybrid one, partly drawing on the neo-institutionalist approach on change, with the concept as isomorphism, well-known, the gradual mechanism change, etc. But also the French policy analysis, in French is Sociologie de l'action publique, which emphasize the local context, the micro-politics, and the sense-making process in the implementation of a policy. We have used three major concepts in our research. The concept of trajectory of the policy, I will come back to this concept. The concept of mediation of policy used at meso or micro level. I will come back also to this concept. And the concept of instrumentation, which is the concept of Lascaux and Le Gallès, who are two researchers of French policy analysis, which is focused on the question of policy tools used, discussed, or non-used at different levels of the policy construction or policy implementation. Just these are the three main concepts of our research. And my aim today is to underline some contribution of a multi-scalar approach. The multi-scalar approach has been proposed and pushed by Rochdale a long time ago. This research is multi-scalar but also comparative. And so it's one of the aims is to underline to what extent it is important to be comparative and multi-scalar in this kind of research. And the second goal of my presentation is to highlight the processes of mediation and of what we'll call bricolage of the policy making and of the policy implementation at different level and stage of the performance-based accountability trajectory. I'm going to start by a very short presentation of the two systems, which is obviously not a full presentation, but which is important to be done before to go into the details. So France is, as you know, probably a very supposedly centralized country from the outset, from the time of Napoleon, with a long-lasting tradition of secularization, laïcité in French, and state schooling, coming from the revolution at the end of 19th century. There are three main levels in the school system: the level of the ministry, the level of the so-called academies, which are large, unity, and the level of the schools themselves, with two independent hierarchies the administrative hierarchy, but also the pedagogical hierarchy with the system of the general inspectorate in France and the academic level inspectors. There has been a move toward decentralization, deconcentration in the 80s and 90s in France, so it's not so as centralized as before. And in the PISA comparison, France appears to be a low performer within the context of the European country, both in terms of efficiency and in terms of inequality. Compared to Quebec, Quebec is a smaller country, of course. It's 8 million inhabitants, so it's only a province of Canada, 30 million inhabitants. But it's a very decentralized country at the outset. At the beginning, it's Catholic and Protestant school boards and very narrow entities at the outset, becoming more large with the time, with a very recent takeover of the system by the state in the 60s and the period called Révolution Tranquille, when Quebec took a larger autonomy within Canada. And at the same time, there has been a process of secularization of the school system in Quebec, and a growth of schooling since this period. 3 levels in the system: this ministry, the school boards, and the schools. And there has been a contradictory trends in this country in favor of centralization to the benefit of the state, and at the same time some decentralization in favor of schools. Actually, the school boards have been merged progressively and have been secularized at the end of the 80s, the beginning of the 90s. So, compared to France, Quebec and Canada in general, Ontario, is a top performer in the PISA scores. So you see that these two systems are quite different, but they are developing close performance-based accountability policies. They use the same repertory of tools, for example, school strategic plans or success plan or school project, this kind of tools of planning what the school intends to do and realize. Another tool is the external testing or external exams, who in both countries are ancient tools already in place for long with the baccalaureate in France, or with external exam by the ministry in Quebec since in the 60s. Another tool, the goals of these accountability policies are close the same. It's maybe in many countries the goals are close, but it's to improve the graduation rate, to limit dropout rate, to improve the student performance in key topics in the external exam, also to improve the public school legitimacy with a significant network of private schools in both countries. These are low-stake accountability policies. No firing of principals, no firing of teachers, no financial incentive to the school or to the teacher, etc., as in the US or in England, for example. So it's low-stakes accountability system with some obvious difference, a more formal policy in Quebec with successive bills, laws, building this policy, compared with a very informal process, a cognitive process in the administration leading to what they call the outcome-based steering or steering by result. It's pilotage par les résultats in France. In Quebec, we use the name result-based management or gestion axée sur les résultats. So there are specific words to name this kind of policy, which are close the same. Thus, our methodology is comparative and multi-scalar, as I mentioned, but the design of the comparison, as I've just mentioned, is the use of the most likely case on the most different system. So the two different systems are developing a common global governance policy, so what we call a performance-based accountability policy, and they are developing this policy in their own way through mediation at different levels. I will exemplify some of this mediation. So the approach is multi-scalar with three main levels: global, national, because at this level, that not only this level, but it's one of the level where there is merging trends from global and national sources, meso or intermediate level at the level of the school board, so and local level. You see a very sketchy presentation of these three levels. We have analyzed the making of the policy at the central national level, at the level of the political system, also the forum around the political system. We have analyzed the policies, the implementation at the intermediate level with the study of 3 academies in France and 4 school boards in Quebec, with an emphasis on the tools and on the implementation of these tools at this level. And at the local level in France, it was the empirical investigation was focused on 6 public lycées and 3 private ones, compared to 6 secondary schools in francophone Quebec system in Quebec. I could come back on the methodological aspect of this research in detail in the discussion if you want. So more precisely at the meso level of the school boards or academies, this, the school boards and academies were chosen with different profiles from academic perspective or from socio-economic perspective, but it was also, the choice was also related to the voluntary agreement of the school board to take part to this project. So this is important to say also. We have made 61 interviews in Quebec and 38 in France, and we have made also a documentary analysis of the tools and the paper, the administrative significative papers of this intermediate level. So I'm going to start with the result, with the analysis of some aspect of the trajectory of the policy, mainly at the global national level. And as I mentioned, trajectory is one of our central concepts in this research, and we draw upon the notion of the approach of trajectory made by Stephen Ball, who will be there tomorrow. Fortunately, he's not there today, so, because we have translated and interpreted this notion, which is very open as usual. So for Stephen, this notion of trajectory is related to an approach sensitive to the dynamic and the transformative character of public action, of a policy in general, in all stages, in the making of the policy at the central level, but also in the following steps in the implementation process. And so this approach implies the dialectic of external and internal processes, but also the dialectic between the levels in the process of implementation of the policy. Thus, in our approach, we analyze this policy trajectory as an outcome, a combination of three processes. The first is related to some process thematized by the neo-institutionalist approach, for example, the well-known past dependency of policy related to some key institution, but also related to key mobilization of actors defending some institution in a political debate. Or the second notion is translation. The notion has been developed by Michel Calon with the sociology of translation about technical scientific tools. And this notion is that there is translation by actors of policy ideas or instruments from one country to another, or from one scene, one level of a political nation to another. And the third concept is the concept of bricolage, of political bricolage, of ideas and instruments in the context of negotiation and struggle among actors. I will come back to this concept of bricolage in the next minute. I would add that the trajectory of the policy is, of course, affected by the process of enactment of policy at the different levels. So the trajectory is the result. The main idea is to have the idea that there is no such a thing as a very limited and defined the policy is such a thing as a substantive content which is implemented in the following step. The policy itself is changing along the timeline due to very various processes located at different levels of the system. So there is the policy is a very I forget the content is a flou. Okay. Flow. Yeah. So in this presentation, I will underline the heuristic virtue of this notion of bricolage, and it is certainly the detailed analysis of political and cognitive bricolage, as well as the process of institutional inertia or institutional change at play in the development of this accountability policy that explains why the trajectory of the policies in both countries are oriented to what we call a neo-statist trajectory. So what do we mean by neo-statist trajectory? So a number of principles of new public management as transparency, evaluation, responsibilization, accountability of local operators can be found in the statement on accountability policy in both countries, but in eliminating a key element of new public management discourse is the idea of market, of competition. So, in opposition to this neoliberal variant of the new public management discourse, we witness in France and Quebec the establishment of a neo-statist version of new public management, what we call a neo-statist version of new public management, where above all it is a vertical policy and administrative regulation which is instituted, which is reinforced in the both countries. Thus, the power of regulation of the central state has grown due to the force of increased cognitive framing in France, and in Quebec we observe a reinforcement of vertical regulation and alignment of meso level and school level in organizational bodies. This idea that we call a neo-statist translation of new public management, or the character of the general trajectory of the both policy in the both countries. So I would like now emphasize some process of the bricolage involved in the making of this neo-statist trajectory, particularly in Quebec. Unfortunately, Xavier Ponce is not there to explain some detailed bricolage of the policy trajectory in France. But first, I would like to give you some other precision on this concept of bricolage. As you know, maybe this concept has been first used by Claude Lévi-Strauss in 1962, La pensée sauvage. And after, this concept has been used in policy analysis. And in this domain, bricolage means that public action is a dynamic assembly of heterogeneous elements in their natural or evolving state, and such elements are not necessarily designed to be tied together. And for example, these elements are institutional arrangement already in place in the country. It could be new policy tools. It could be discursive narrative or the policy narrative. It could be ideas taken from transnational repertoire, etc. And this composite construction is related to the political process of negotiation and struggle inside different arenas. It could be political arena, but it could be larger arena with a lot of stakeholders of the policy. It could be a principal association, school board association, representative, could be scientific. So there are different, Elisabeth Fouilleux, the French polity analysis, called that forums, as scientific forums, or policy-making forums. It could be transnational, it could be national. So in this forum or arenas, the public problems to solve are defined and developed, and the policy is meant to deal with this problem and to offer solutions and to legitimize the solution proposed. In this figure, maybe you can I don't know if you can read something. It's difficult because it's a figure. But this is the trajectory of the result-based management in Quebec. And it presents, the chronology presents the main bill. For example, the first bill is here in 2000. It's a general bill about result-based management in the whole administration, public administration in Quebec. Another important bill is 2002 Bill 124, Bill 88 in 2008, and in 2016, after the investigation was complete of the U8 project, there has been a new bill, Bill 105. So you see that in Quebec, strictly, if you are talking about RBM policy, you have to talk about these four bills. But a lot of elements which are taking part to this policy have been built before. And if you are going to look at the tools of the policy, the RBM is assembling tools as school project here. But the idea of school project in Quebec at the outset was starting 76. And this notion has evolved till 2016. So it's a very old and very changing notion. I will come back to this. Another key tool is plans. The strategic plans was institutionalized or legalized by the Bill 124 in 2002. But actually, this notion was used in different forums before, already in 2000. A third tools of performance-based accountability are the quantified targets that the school or the school will have to reach or are supposed to reach. But this notion of target appears clearly in 2008 with the Bill 80. But this notion of targets was already used before, and the indicators of the system were first defined and used in '64. So the assemblage, the bricolage of all the ingredients of this performance-based accountability have different source and different truths, and they have been assembled in the successive bills. So, of course, this is a chronology. So the first idea beyond trajectories to deploy a policy along the timeline. And this gives the impression that there is a linear process leading to result-based management. And many scientific accounts in Quebec of RBM are completely linear. It's a theological narrative of the... But in fact, this impression of linearity is false. Since some school, as I mentioned, school projects or external exam, external testing were put in place independently of RBM or the idea of accountability. So it has been assembled later. Moreover, there is a changing repertoire of tools. There is a changing names, changing meanings, and content of the tools related to RBM. And this is the result of the bricolage and sedimentation or layering of different policy tools along the time. So I'm going to exemplify some cognitive bricolage of tools and some political discursive bricolage in this process. So, so the bricolage is cognitive in the sense that it's related to the meaning and the content associated with the tools that operationalize the policy. So not only there is a layering implementation of tools, as I mentioned, first school project, second strategic plan or success plan, and thirdly with the Bill 88 in 2008, Bill 88, yes, 88, bring another key tool is the contracts, the agreement between the level of the system, contracts between schools and school board, between school board and the national ministry. So there is a layering and successive apparition of these various tools, but moreover, the meaning and function of the tools are changing with what we call the configuration of tools. And I'm going to take just one example with school project. So at the beginning, in '96, with Bill, I'm sorry for the numbers of the bills, maybe it's confusing for you, but so in '96, with the Bill 180, this policy tool was very important. It was in the discussion of a decentralization of competencies towards schools, and the school project was an important tool, but designed to develop an horizontal accountability from school to their community, to the parents, but the community, the local community at large. And this accountability was about the project, the values, the color of the school in general. So this is the main meaning, and which is still associated with this label school project till now. But in 2002, the success plan was institutionalized, and the school project was minorized by the success plan, which bring a vertical accountability about the result and about with some evaluation of the result by indicators, etc. In '88, the school project was completely drawn in a complex repertoire of tools: success plan, agreement, school project. And in 2016, this bill recasts this old tool of school project, in the sense that it is become the main RBM tool at the school level. So the new school project merge all the previous tools, and this bill seeks indeed to simplify this bureaucratic burden of result-based management. So but if you look at the content of these tools instead of the name of the tools, this new school project reinforced the mechanism of vertical coordination while using the label school project associated with local democracy. So this is example of what we mean by cognitive and political bricolage of one tool, but you can apply this reasoning about mainly all tools. This is a changing configuration of instrument tools, but also of meanings of these tools for everybody. And of course, this cognitive bricolage is related to a political bricolage too. So it's the analytic distinction between cognitive and political bricolage. But I will now to exemplify what I mean by discursive and political bricolage of this neo-statist policy, already also in Quebec. The bricolage is also related to the construction of what Radaeli called policy narrative in the making of the policy, and policy narrative during the decade 2000. So the neo-statist policy has been made through changing political bargaining, but also the bricolage within and between various policy narratives endorsed by various actors, government, successive government with different political color, but also stakeholders as school board representative, trade union, teachers trade union, unions or principals association. Three main narratives were in competition to define or discuss what should be RBM policy in a consultation process. And these narratives are just defining the problems to solve, the solution to promote, and each of them includes a theory of change. And this theory of change includes or rejects some elements of new public management. So the discursive bricolage and political bricolage came through the mediation of this policy narrative. For example, a key narrative developed by the successive government and by school board representatives display a bricolage allowing for an association of all key problems of the system and high dropout rate, and also the dysfunctioning or even the crisis of what is called the school democracy in Quebec. There is local election of commissioner in the school board. So, but there is a dysfunctioning or crisis of this local democracy. It's the same, approximately the same system as in US, school board, and as in the US school district with election, etc. So this is the key problem that RBM would contribute to solve. There are some existing tools, school project, as I mentioned, external exam, but also existing structure which is involved in this policy narrative. And new solution brought in selectively from the repertoire of NPM, contracts, plan, targets, accountability, etc. So this key narrative to cure the ills of the Quebec system, the solution proposed involves at the same time to maintain the three pillars of the system: ministry, school board, schools, but also to improve the alignment and coordination of the three levels through contracting, through plant, etc., with the target tools, and etc. And this discourse was clearly opposed to another narrative which is predominantly that of an opposition party. And this narrative proposed to deal with the same problem with different tools by emphasizing tools that would mix market competition and local parents' participation. So this policy narrative proposed to reform radically the structure of the system, to remove the school board, to downsize the school board, to remove the local election, and to promote autonomy of the schools. But this alternative narrative was closer to a neoliberal version of new public management. And because he brought in more elements from a logic of marketization. But this discourse was destined to remain an opposition party discourse. The bills have been influenced by the previous narrative. So, to summarize, the narratives, the dominant or the alternative narratives, are doing cognitive bricolage when discursively selecting different elements of NPM doctrine in order to build the solution and the theory of change of the policy, preserving or rejecting existing institutional arrangement, for example, school boards, and combining their solutions with the old problem of the system. This is an example of what I call bricolage, assemblage of various heterogeneous elements which build the policy. And in parallel, this political bricolage, there is also political bricolage between the narrative along the timeline. For example, the instrumentation of the policy is depending on the balance of force and the force of the unions, for example. The force of unions was more important in 2002 than in the next decade. So the targets became more important in the later period. Okay. I will finish with bricolage with one more precision, is that bricolage is not the only source of the policy trajectory, because, as I already mentioned, there are two other key processes. The past dependence on previous institutions, for example, the fact that school boards are still there is related to a past dependence process, related to some laws in the Canadian Constitution which preserve the rights of the Anglophone minorities in Quebec, which is a factor of inertia of the. It's not so easy from a legal point of view to remove the school board. And the actual government here in Quebec have been elected 8 months ago with, in its program, the idea to remove the school boards. And we are still waiting. We are still waiting, but so we have submit our analysis to the test of facts with already 2 projects after or the end of our investigation, who give us not the proof, but some validation of this hypothesis of the process of past dependence of this key institution in Quebec. The other process is translation. Thus, I have the time to develop this other process. This is developed largely in the book. And I'm now turning to the mediation of the policy that could also influence the trajectory of the policy. I have 5 minutes, okay. I'm gonna...
No, it's
So the fundamental idea behind this notion is that accountability are co-construct on a permanent basis all levels of public action by different actors who participate in their conception and their implementation. And thus the actors transfer, interpret and contextualize these policies depending on policy trajectory, policy tools, and also what we call local educational order in which they evolve. And what the New Age project has shows, there are two main results. First, there are important variation in the implementation and enactment of this policy in each national context. Second, logic of dilution, appropriation, and amplification of national policy are present and result from a number of internal processes within the academies or school boards. And finally, we could say that variations are much more obvious in France, in a so-called centralized country, than in Quebec, which is supposed to be decentralized. So this logic of mediation, to analyze them, we draw on the Malins, Betty Malin's typology to describe the micro-political games as policy is implemented, and the dominant orientation of those games and the pattern they produce, we call them logic of mediation or logic of action of these academies or school boards. Logic of dilution means that there are policy strategies which contribute to the erosion, indeed the complete ineffectiveness of an educational policy. Logic of appropriation means that local actors selectively embrace policy from afar and then couple them with their local interest. Logic of amplification, the intermediate or the local authority are not content merely to implement the reform, they also create the condition for what they hope to be a lasting commitment of local actors to the goals of the policy, and sometimes going further than foreseen at the national level. And nullification proceeds on efforts to nullify or revoke policy. So we have, this is the synthesis of our results. You see that only one logic of dilution in the Eastern Academy in France, and in both countries, logic of appropriation and logic of amplification of policy. So there is variation between the intermediate level in each country. We have used a theoretical model to understand this various logic of mediation, and we have related to 4 factors that interact and condition the enactments of performance-based accountability systems. So this here, the interaction of these 4 factors is what we call local educational orders. It could be at meso level or local level. And so these local orders are influenced by the context, both market context or institutional context. The problematization by the higher officer of the educational issue of their bodies, of their school board or their school. What is at stake in their school board? Also influenced by the professional ethos of these higher officers. is it a modernist view of organization or traditional view? Could influence. Also, it is in interaction with the problematization of the education, and also the configuration of actor, the configuration of the interest of the actor, the configuration of the relation. Is it a strong union or not? In the case, for example, or is it good cooperation with the principal of the school board or not, etc. This lead to, it's a bit simplified, this lead to various mediation and logic, and this mediation of logic produce different type of governance by results. This is and to give you a short example of the application of this model, for example, in the case of Eastern Academy in France, there is thus a dilution logic of mediation, which is due to, first of all, the context. There are many structural difficulties in this academy, which is close to Paris. And it combines high level of poverty, high turnover of staff, violence covered by media, high union resistance, and so result consistently below the average. And the main issue for the higher officer in this academy is to normalize the problem, to normalize the academy. It's not to modernize the organization, to become a good pupil of the steering by result, not at all. So they want to come back to ordinary legislation procedure. They want to remove passion of the debate, and so their ethos is to introduce some new tools about indicator, etc., but with a perspective of management which is still focused not on result but on resource and on means. This is related to the configuration of actors, as I mentioned, high union resistance, high reaction of and sensitivity of course principles, high turnover also of the higher officer, of the rectors of the academy, who have political profiles. In the amplification logic, the picture is completely different. They have demographic problem, result poorer than expected, competition from private everywhere. And in Quebec, the legitimacy of public school and public school board at stake, also union opposition, but not so high as in the other. And their ethos is one of overt organizational modernism, with for them the main issue is to modernize the governance of the schools and the governance of the school board. This is not to normalize. And they are, depending on the configuration of factor, there are various ways to introduce new public management in the school boards. Sometimes it's radical change and confrontation, and sometimes it's incremental negotiation in the process. So this is an example very shortly. This leads to different, the policy is, the discourse is the same, approximately close, but at the end, in the schools, there are different government by reason. It could be, in the dilution, it could be a bureaucratic management by result with weak instrumentation. Xavier told us the school plans, they have disappeared from the administrative, they don't find them, the school plans. So they are the schools are supposed to do that, but they lose it. So at the end there is a decoupling still in there, and a protection of the teacher's sphere of autonomy. At the opposite, in the amplification logic, there is intensive management of the pedagogical practice, even if it's a low-stake accountability policy, with different use of instrumentation, so a strong instrumentation of the policy, beyond the policy requirements, because the ethos of this higher officer in the school level order are completely in favor of the result management perspective. And this is what we call a regulatory result-based governance. And appropriation is an in-between between these two logics. So you see that you cannot look at this policy only at the national level to evaluate what is going on really on the field. And I would like to finish with one last point. Is, as I mentioned, there are more convergences in the decentralized Quebec. Why? And this is here the virtue or the heuristic power of the new institutionalist tools. There are 4 factors of institutional isomorphism which are at play in Quebec. First, there is a normative isomorphism due to the fact that the professional milieu of school administrators is already established, and this milieu is relaying norms and ID in accordance with the philosophy of RBN. It's due to the fact that my faculty, the other education faculties, train all these school administrators. And the content of the course is oriented towards school effectiveness, school improvement. And this built some consensus about the fact that school matters, teachers matters. There are no doubt about that. So this is really important to see. Second, there is an explicit borrowing of practice of the neighbor, the Ontario policy and the implementation of the Ontarian policy in Francophone school boards from Ontario. And in 3 of our 4 school boards, they have import some recipes and stews and coming from these Ontario example. So this is a mimetic mechanism, because they say, okay, Ontario is one of the best provinces in Canada, so we should follow their example. Third, there is academic entrepreneurs of change who are traveling around the various school boards, the same, and they are selling result-based management. And finally, more explicit ministerial prescription in Quebec with detailed implementation guide, much more detailed and with a calendar, an agenda, a calendar very precise in Quebec, different from France from this point of view. So conclusion. The true education system developed soft and neo-statist accountability policy. The analysis of the trajectory of the policy shows various bricolage. The analysis of the policy implementation showed that there were various logic of mediation of this policy, dilution, appropriation, amplification. And these logic are embedded in local education laws. And finally, there are more divergences in France than in Quebec due to less influence of isomorphic mechanism in France than in Quebec. So it's a curious paradox in a centralized country. So thank you for your attention.